Joining us now, Eli Friedman. He's a professor at Cornell University's School of Industrial and Labor Relations, author of The China Question, Toward Left Perspectives, edited with Kevin Lin and Ashley Smith. Eli, welcome to the program. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, it's great to be here.
Will you, we're seeing protests in China. It's unclear, I guess, at least to me, like how widespread. But will you give us just, I guess, maybe like a 10,000 foot view of contextualizing these protests relative to ones that we've seen, like for instance in 1989? Where does this fit in that regard? Sure.
So there's a lot of comparisons happening between what's happening now and in 1989. The scale is almost certainly not on the same level as it was in 89, when you had hundreds of thousands of people in Tiananmen Square. You also had big protests that were happening in other parts of China in 1989. And so the mobilizations have been smaller in scale. They've been more fractured, maybe in more cities this time than was the case in 89. They also have already more or less died down just in the past week, and that's due in part to repression, but also some important concessions that we can talk about. And so there's debate about how many people are actually on the street, which is maybe not the most significant thing, but they're clearly not on the same scale. I think it's also worth mentioning, sometimes people have this misconception that China's an authoritarian country and therefore people never protest. And that's actually not true. So after 1989, you don't have the same big scale, very politicized kind of protest, but you do have quite a lot of small scale localized protests, labor protests, peasants whose land has been taken, things over environmental issues. So there actually has been a fair amount of unrest. It just hasn't been coordinated and organized at kind of the national level in the way that we've been seeing in late November.
So outside of scale, I mean, qualitatively, like what was 1989 about relative to what we see now? And then I also want to go back and ask a question about that nature of localized protests and what happens. But qualitatively speaking, 1989, it's not what we're seeing now is not of the scale, but what was the impetus then versus the impetus now from your perspective?
Sure. So the big demand in 1989 that was oftentimes not super clearly articulated was democracy. And there's these interviews they talk to the students and they talk to the workers, a part of the protest that oftentimes is overlooked. And they didn't necessarily have a very clearly articulated vision for what a democratic China would look like, but they understood that there was something that they were dissatisfied with the existing political system, and that they wanted things to move in a more democratic direction, right? And so in that sense, it was a pretty direct challenge to one-party rule. These protests...
Can I ask you, and we should say, just for folks who are not as old as me, but that was part of this is the time, we were just around the time, the fall of the Berlin Wall. I mean, so this is in the air in terms of these expectations of democracy. And I guess it's also the sort of the notion of like the possibility of the introduction of democracy.
Yeah, that's right. The protests in China took place in April, May, and then the crackdown was in early June. So it actually preceded the fall of the Berlin Wall by several months. But there was a key moment in 1989 when Gorbachev was actually in town, and he was a reformist. He didn't want to see the collapse of the Soviet Union, which is eventually what happened, right? But clearly there were big critiques that were being leveled against one-party communist rule in Eastern Europe. So yeah, it definitely was part of that bigger movement. Of course, there was very different outcomes in Eastern Europe and Russia than there was in China.
I feel like there was also like a big a concert like Bowie played sometime around there too that had started the talk of this in the late 80s. There was a couple of rock concerts that seemed to sort of like kick off that move. Maybe that's just my imagination. But
Gorbachev going to like Taco Bell and stuff like that as well, right? That was around that time.
It was certainly in the air. It feels like, but but please continue. Sorry.
Well, I don't actually know about the Bowie. I'm pretty certain that the first foreign band that was allowed to play in China in the 80s was Wham, George Michael. So I don't know. I don't know what George Michael was talking about. But
well, he was a revolutionary force in many respects.
It was. I do think that one of the big differences in terms of thinking about '89 versus the present moment is that there's this sense of critiquing of authoritarianism, of one-party rule. If you look at the present moment, actually, most countries are becoming less democratic. Right now, they have different baselines, and so China has never been very democratic, and it has become more authoritarian, more repressive. But just about every other country in the world is also, facing severe challenges to democracy. And so there isn't that same kind of international zeitgeist that might have existed in '89.
And so this feels like it has been both in its genesis and in the way that we've seen it recede, a function of like the COVID policy that China was pursuing.
That's
right. Give us a sense of it started at was it started at the Foxconn plant, or give us a sense of how this sort of like spread, and what it says about, how much, what level of risk was associated with this? Because you say that there's also plenty of local protests. Like, what level of risk is assumed in a protest like that?
So there's different ways of telling the recent history of these protests. I think we should trace it back to the Shanghai lockdown of April 2022. And that was a time when I think people really began dissenting with the zero COVID policy in a way that was very, very different than if we go back to the Wuhan lockdown of 2020, when there was just a lot of social support, a lot of buy-in for those extreme measures. By 2022 in Shanghai, things are very different. Like, the rest of the world has moved on and the virus has mutated. It's much harder to control, and it's basically endemic everywhere else in the world. And so people are kind of fed up with it. And you saw actually much more individualized kinds of resistance and griping happening in Shanghai and in all of the big cities over the summer and into the fall, where there were periodic lockdowns. The kind of immediate chain of events that led up to the big protests were first the things that happened at Foxconn, the Zhengzhou Foxconn facility that produces about 3/4 of the world's iPhones. And there was a big worker uprising there because they were keeping workers in the so-called closed loop system, where they go into the factory and they're not allowed to leave. They were being exposed to the virus. They weren't getting adequate food or medical attention. And so there was this huge uprising. Then there was a fire in Urumqi, which is the capital of Xinjiang in northwestern China. There was at least 10 people who died in this fire, all or most of whom were Uyghurs, which I think is significant against the backdrop of the repression and the internment camps that Muslim minorities have been subjected to. And this really resonated with people because there was this feeling that these people might not have died had it not been for the lockdown. In some cases, people have been actually just chained in their apartments, right? And so the fire risk is very real. And so the thing that then set off nationwide protest was a response to the fire that killed people in Urumqi, and they were framed as vigils, right? And so framing something as a vigil rather than a protest against the central government is, it's a little bit softer, a little bit more space for tolerance. But then to come to the final question about how much risk is implied, well, it's ambiguous, right? According to the Chinese constitution, Chinese people have the right to freedom of association, freedom of speech. Everybody understands that those things are not actually realized. But when some of those protests targeted not just the kind of the local implementation of the zero policy, that's relatively safe, although not perfectly safe, and they began targeting the national policy, most famously in the protests that happened in Shanghai, people were chanting, "Down with Xi Jinping, down with the Communist Party," right? So when you're at a protest where those kinds of chants are happening, then the risk is really increased significantly.
So it's one thing to say, like, our local councilman is doing this wrong, as opposed to the people who are really in charge of that first order. They're illegitimate, I guess, is where you start to cross the line.
That's right.
Well, and I want to get to the Uyghurs in a moment too. But what was the theory behind the zero COVID policy? I mean, and certainly I understand it in the context of 2020 and in the context of early 2021. I mean, but at one point when the rest of the world does start to sort of open up more, and I happen to believe that maybe in many respects we've done it more aggressively than I think is probably ultimately we're going to find is has been healthy for us. But you don't have that. There's more pressure on the Chinese government. You don't have that sense of like, we don't want to be the one country that is, we're all sort of in the same boat now. And it's sort of, there seems to be this sort of like international sort of acceptance of like, yeah, you know what, we're now okay with 3 times the amount of people dying from, as opposed to the flu. And we're all in the same boat where we're going to have a weakened immunity system maybe, and long COVID's going to be a feature of humanity. And we've just, accepted it. Like what was the theory? Is it that, I mean, because we're talking about well over 1 billion people. And so when you start to get into like tiny percentages, we're talking a lot of people. Were they worried about hospitals? What was their, I guess maybe just, and analogize it for folks. We're worried about flattening the curve because we thought our hospitals could get overwhelmed at one point. What was their primary concern?
Yeah. So there are some good reasons for pursuing zero COVID, and there are some not so good reasons. So let me do the not so good reasons first. If you look back to 2020, they had the very intense lockdown in Wuhan, and they crushed the virus, right? At the same time, the virus is beginning to spread around the world, and we're all familiar with what happened in the United States and Western Europe and other places. It led to mass death, right? Millions of people are dying. In China, they crushed it. They sealed the borders. They pursued zero COVID, and in the process, they saved hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of lives, which is wonderful, right? But they made a big deal out of this politically, right? And so they said this demonstrates the superiority of the Chinese system against all the other systems in the world, but really they're just talking about the United States, right? And so authoritarianism is better than democracy responding to this. Of course, they're ignoring the successes of places like Taiwan, especially Japan, Australia, New Zealand, these countries that have also done very, very well in democratic systems. But in any event, they made a big deal out of it. Xi Jinping took personal ownership of it and said, we're going to stick with this to demonstrate our superiority. Now, time is going by. We get to 2022. The rest of the world has been through this mass death and all this other problems that you were just alluding to. But we come out of it, and I mean, we're not out of it, but the very intense period is behind us. And China, in the meantime, has stuck with the zero COVID and had this kind of hubris that they'd be able to continue to do it indefinitely. And so they have not, in the meantime, gone about making the accommodations to eventually exit. And they have to exit because it is endemic, right? If they want to be part of the world at this point, they have no choice. So they have not done an adequate job vaccinating the population. If you look at the vaccination rates among seniors, it's quite bad, right? They have not approved mRNA vaccines that were produced in Europe and the United States, basically out of national pride. And so they're using domestic vaccines, the old kind of technology that is much less effective. And there's suggestions that it's almost ineffective, at least at preventing infection against Omicron, may still be somewhat more effective against hospitalization and deaths. And their ICU capacity, their respirator capacity is quite bad, actually, and it's particularly bad in outside of the big cities. So given that backdrop, if today they were just going to say, we're going to let it rip, kind of America style, there'd be millions of people dead. And so I think that it is complicated, right? The zero COVID has a justification of saving lives. They can't do it forever, right? And so now the question, part of the reason why people are so mad is they have not been making these preparations for the fact that the virus is one day going to spread in China. And so they're in a really tough position right now. And there hasn't been, is there also sort of like an issue of
the supposed informed consent type of thing, like where, half the, a significant portion of this country was like, yeah, we're okay with this about a mass test. I mean, it's a little disturbing. I would say it's very disturbing, but there has been a significant portion of this country that's just like, we're just okay with this mass death. And, I don't want to have to wear a mask when I go to the supermarket. And so that's that. They haven't been through that process yet, right? Where there's an opportunity for people to sort of witness and then accept, I guess, or hope or not, the mass death. And so they're still sort of like, it's almost like they're going to have to go through their sort of COVID adolescence at a later date. Is that sort of the situation?
Yeah, although part of the issue is that they are keenly aware of the mass death because that has been a key propaganda talking point for the government. Remember, the whole point is the Chinese system is superior. Look at all these dead bodies piling up in New York City and in London and wherever else. So they really know about that. There's also been a lot of discussion in official media, which is of course all state controlled, about how dangerous the virus is and remains. They're trying to walk some of that back now as they are walking away from zero COVID. But people in China, I would say, on average, are much more concerned about the virus than people are in the United States. You don't have that same kind of polarization. Like wearing a mask in China is just like not an issue. Everyone does that. But they're very worried about it. So, you have these protests, which I support, and I think ending the zero COVID policy, at least as it's been implemented, it's been very destructive. I think that's a good thing. But you do need to have this pathway out, and inevitably it's going to generate opposition from people who are concerned about those health effects, right? And we'll see if zero COVID gets ended in kind of a haphazard way without the proper development of health infrastructure, then it could be extremely destructive. And that in and itself could also generate other kinds of political problems for the state. Has
this sort of like this pushback or against the zero COVID policy, has that also sort of calmed things in terms of Taiwan? Because it feels like we were on the precipice of something, and now it feels like we're not quite, or am I just kidding myself and we still are?
No, I think you're right. I'm actually going to Taiwan on Saturday, so pleased to see that things are going to be a little bit calmer. We're definitely not out of the woods with respect to Taiwan, and that's another whole issue. I mean, the Chinese government reserves the right to use force, and they frequently talk about how they will use force to annex Taiwan, if and when they want to. The immediate crisis over Nancy Pelosi's visit has passed. China had, in my view, a pretty over-the-top militaristic kind of a response to that. But even before the zero COVID thing happened, that had kind of calmed down a little bit. Now, this does provide another kind of distraction. Xi Jinping is spending his time now thinking about how to exit zero COVID rather than what to do about Taiwan. But the problem is fundamentally still there. I mean, there's no diplomatic resolution to that problem remotely in sight.
Was there anything that, aside from Pelosi's visit, that rose tensions? Like, I don't understand like why tensions would be less or more in any given point, because this has been going on for decades.
Yeah. It's against the backdrop of worsening U.S.-China relations, right? So particularly from the Trump administration on, we've seen heightened hostility in a variety of spheres, right? Most famously, I think, on trade under Trump. Biden has more or less continued those. I mean, he's less unhinged and less racist, certainly in his rhetoric about China. But there is pretty much bipartisan consensus in DC right now around getting tough on China. And Biden, in some ways, has been more, he's definitely been more effective at corralling allies into confronting China, right? So we see the AUKUS pact between the United States, UK, and Australia. We see a reinvigorated Quad, which is the India, Australia, Japan, and the United States coordinating military activities. So all of these things are happening in a context where China feels, both China and the United States feel threatened. I mean, the United States has legitimate, critiques of China as well. And so I get against that backdrop, the Taiwan issue has also just become more serious.
The other day, Biden was in a Phoenix plant, a semiconductor plant that was sort of notably owned by mainland Chinese interests as opposed to Taiwanese interests.
No. TSMC is Taiwanese owned.
Oh, okay. I had that backwards. All right. That makes more sense because I was wondering, like, why would he do that? But now I get it. All right.
No. He's very clearly, the Commerce Department is very clearly trying to kneecap the development of China's semiconductors.
Okay. Yes. I was confused by that, and I appreciate that. All right. One more question. You mentioned that the fire in Urumqi, I guess.
Urumqi.
And the deaths of 10 Uyghurs there. Where are we in terms of our understanding of what the Chinese policy has been towards the Uyghurs and what they have done? I mean, we've over the past couple of years, I feel like we've had competing reports as to Uyghurs are being sent to internment camps, Uyghurs are being sent to death camps. What is your best understanding of what has happened in regard to the Uyghurs?
So there's definitely a lot of information that we do not have, and we have to piece it together from various sources. There is little doubt that hundreds of thousands, if not more than 1 million Uyghurs have been sent to non-voluntary camps. Some people call them concentration camps. The Chinese government refers to them as re-education centers, but it is a non-voluntary form of at least temporary incarceration that does not go through any kind of legal procedure. So that really took off in 2017, and there's overwhelming evidence from satellites from the Chinese government's own statements that demonstrate that this has happened. It's become a little bit more complicated since then. There's some evidence that many of those have been shut down. I should say that there is no evidence that there are death camps. People have definitely died while in custody because they've been beaten to death or they had some health issue that was not treated. But when you say concentration camps, people just think of the Holocaust, and there's no evidence that it is eliminationist. It is assimilationist, though. So they are forcing people to learn Mandarin. They are giving them some kind of job training and oftentimes dispatching them to these forced labor arrangements to private companies, some of which are integrated into the global supply chains of American and European corporations. And there's also been evidence that they are shifting more from these internment camps to mass incarceration. So actually going through some sort of legal procedure where they are charging people with separatism or something like that, and then giving them long jail sentences. And so you can actually look at the Chinese government's own data. The number of people incarcerated on long-term jail sentences of over 5 years has gone up really dramatically in the last few years. So there's no question that hundreds of thousands of people are still missing, and really the only crime that they committed was being Uyghur or being Muslim.
Interesting. Eli Friedman, professor at Cornell University School of Industrial Labor Relations, author of The China Question. Thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate it. Really helpful.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks very much.